Hello, and welcome to the Cambridge PhD podcasts. Today we're talking to Katy Barrett, who's a PhD student at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and she's going to be talking to us about the vexed question of longitude in the 18th century. So Katy, if you'd like to give us a bit of an introduction.
Okay, well, in a nutshell, I do cultural history of longitude in the 18th century. And longitude is a problem of navigation at sea. So most people know what longitude and latitude are, but just because sometimes some people don't, if my fist is a globe, the longitude lines go from north to south, the latitude lines go around like that. So the equator is a latitude line. And latitude is very easy to measure at sea because you can observe the height of the sun. Longitude is not so easy to measure because it's not linked to distinct points on the globe or in the night sky. So you can do it with various things to do with observing the stars or timekeepers. And neither of these methods had been well developed at the beginning of the 18th century. And the 18th century becomes really important in terms of accurate navigation because it's when British trade and naval power becomes important. So it's when it really matters that you want to be able to get your commodities or your slaves or your naval crews from A to B in a reliable amount of time with as little death or decay as possible. So various European countries are interested in longitude, but I look at Britain because in 1714 the British government passed the Longitude Act, which did two things. One, it established something called the Board of Longitude, which was a series of commissioners based on their official roles, so things like Astronomer Royal, Professors Oxford and Cambridge, Admirals in the Navy, and it gave them prize money or reward money to encourage people to find means of measuring longitude at sea. And I am part of a research project that is wider than me. There are 8 of us working on it, between the History and Philosophy of Science Department here in Cambridge and the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And that's because the archives of the Board of Longitude are handily in the University Library, about however many metres in that direction. And the instruments are in Greenwich. So as a whole, we look at the history of the Board of Longitude from 1714, when it was founded, to 1828, when it was turned into an advisory committee. And I look at the cultural history of that. So the ways in which it was discussed by people who weren't involved in the scientific questions, how it became a joke, how it crops up in plays and poems and paintings, and is used to discuss wider social concerns.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose the question is, why does it become such a big issue in the 18th century? I mean, why is it on everybody's lips? What is it about longitude that makes it so interesting to people?
Well, I've been trying to think of a good contemporary comparison, and the best one I can come up with at the moment is that it's like climate change. So we all talk about climate change at the moment. We know it's important, whether or not we believe that it's a real scientific problem. But a lot of us talk about it without really understanding what it means, and we use it jokingly, semi-jokingly, to talk about other things that are happening in contemporary life. So longitude similarly gets used because I think essentially it's because there's a huge amount of reward money associated with it. So the fact that you can win £20,000 at the time if you accurately measure longitude at sea,
which is an enormous amount.
It's a huge amount of money, so it's very difficult to do money comparisons across time. But £20,000 would probably equate to about £1 million today, so it's not a small amount of money.
Yeah.
And the fact that that money was available and so many people were interested in it meant that it became a joke in society about people trying to find longitude and why they did that.
So what first brought you to studying this, and what was it that left out about longitude to you?
Well, there's a number of things. So I come from a history of art background, and there is a series of paintings and engravings by William Hogarth, the well-known 18th century caricaturist, called The Rake's Progress, which he made in 1735. And that is a series of 8 engravings about a young man in contemporary London called Tom Rakewell, who is corrupted by London society, essentially. So he arrives, he has lots of money, he becomes fashionable, he goes to brothels, he goes to gambling dens, he loses all his money, he gets arrested, he ends up in debtor's prison, and then he dies in the madhouse, Bethlehem Hospital, which is where we get the term Bedlam from. And when he's in Bedlam at the end of the series, he's dying of despairing with madness on the floor. And behind him, there is a figure who is trying to solve longitude on the wall. of his cell in Bedlam.
Mm.
The image is interesting because it's an image of Bedlam, obviously, and you've got a series of generic examples of madmen. So you've got a religious fanatic, a man who thinks he's the king, a man who thinks he's the pope, an unrequited lover, a violinist, because they thought musicians went mad particularly easily, and also a tailor, because tailors went mad particularly easily with pride at making people look better.
Okay.
And then you've got a mad astronomer. So they're all quite generic, not very specific examples of madness, but then amongst these you've got a very specific figure who's solving longitude. So one of the things that interested me was why is Hogarth using such a specific example in this image? Why is he doing it in 1735? Because then he also goes on in the 1760s, he comes back to the engravings when he's getting towards the end of his life. He's getting grumpy and disillusioned with society, and he changes a lot of them. One of the ones he changes is this Hogarth image, and the Bedlam image. And what he does is he adds on the wall the back of a halfpenny over, partly covering the longitude diagram, and it's got Britannia going mad on the back of the pen. And those dates are nice because they frame one of the main stories in the longitude story, which is the one that most people know. So if people have heard of the longitude problem, they've usually read a book by Darva Sabel called Longitude, the True Story of the Lone Genius Who Single-Handedly Solved the Greatest Scientific Issue of His Time, or something like that.
It's a nice long title.
Yeah. And it's a popular story about the clockmaker John Harrison, who's the main figure in the first half of the history of the Board of Longitude, who invented a series of timekeepers for keeping time accurately at sea, which is one of the ways that you can find longitude. And he had a very acrimonious relationship with the commissioners of longitude between the 1730s and 1760s, and caused a number of parliamentary acts, a lot of discussion in the newspapers. He's quite a vociferous character. And Sabel picked up this story, interestingly, after going to a conference, an American conference about timekeepers, and wrote this book about John Harrison as a kind of downtrodden working man trying to battle against the entrenched institutional Board of Longitude, and particularly this character called Neville Maskelyne, who was the Astronomer Royal, who was one of the people very interested in something called the lunar distance method, which is one of the alternative methods for measuring longitude at sea. And Harrison thought that Maskelyne hated him, and Sabel sort of picked up on this and made it a kind of personal rivalry between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
And this was turned into actually a very good film in 2000, with Michael Gambon starring as John Harrison. He's very good. Mm. So that's the story that most people know. John Harrison, downtrodden figure, particularly hated by Neville Maskelyne. The board don't take him seriously because he's a working man, essentially.
Which seems maybe like it might be a little bit too simple.
Exactly, and a little bit over-sensational, shall we say. So what interested me is if you look at wider cultural discussions of longitude, so how it's joked about in newspapers, the way Hogarth uses it, there are a lot of other social factors around things like what is appropriate knowledge, how you draw things on paper, what is appropriate behaviour in society, which are not only about wider public ideas about longitude, but they actually affect the way that Harrison and the Board of Longitude interact. Mm-hmm. So the story is not as simple as it seems.
I'd like to pick out those three ideas and kind of get a bit more information about those, about how this becomes a wider cultural problem than a strictly scientific one. Okay. So do you want to maybe give us a bit more? I'm particularly interested in social behaviour as well.
Okay. I'll actually come to that one last because they kind of build out from each other. So I have sort of three broad ways of looking at cultural longitude. The first of which is visual. So one of the problems that John Harrison and the Board of Longitude have is that he creates this clock. Then how are they going to get the knowledge of the clock from him? How are they going to either write it down on paper, draw diagrams on paper, such that other people can make it? Because one of the really tricky clauses in the Longitude Act is that the solution has to be practical and useful at sea. And it's all a question of how is it practical? At what point does a simple clock become practical? So they have all these discussions about how you draw and write things on paper. And that's all linked into a lot of other concerns about mapping and drawing maps at the time, because this is when projections are being discussed. So a lot of people have heard of the Mercator projection, because if you've got a globe how you put it on paper, you have to distort either size or shape. And how you navigate from those charts is complicated. I brought a little poem. This is from actually quite an early, this is actually pre-Longitude Act, which is one of the other things that doesn't really come out in the current historiography, is that there were interests in longitude before 1714. It wasn't just that. It suddenly
fully formed.
Exactly, but which is another way of thinking about the importance of the reward money. But so this is somebody called John Hearn, who wrote a proposal for longitude in 1678. And he ended it with a poem, which was, Columbus, come hither, with thee thy chart, my skill in longitude to thee I will impart, that when by thee more new worlds are found, upon thy chart their towns thou mayest prick down. So all of these discussions about kind of how you draw a longitude mark on a piece of paper is all linked up to how you draw a clock on a piece of paper. And that's exactly what so I call him the longitude lunatic, the guy in the Hogarth image. That's exactly what he's doing on the wall. So that's visual discussions. And that's, I should say, that's all also linked into, there's discussions about patenting in the period, about copyright changes. Hogarth is also involved in getting the first Copyright and Engravings Act passed at precisely this point. So it's all the way in which people have rights over their knowledge and how it's written on paper is all kind of happening at the same time as they're having these discussions. So that's visual discussions of longitude. Then the second one is mental, and I like that because it's a little bit of a pun. So it's both people who are mental and kind of intellectual ways of thinking about longitude. So
classic chapter title pun.
Thank you very much. So the point about that is that there are a lot of jokes which are fairly obvious from the fact that Hogarth has placed someone solving longitude in Bedlam, that only people who are mad would try and solve longitude, or trying to solve longitude drives you mad. So there's this kind of cyclical relationship between the two. And also that there's this idea in the 18th century about projecting, which is that projects are kind of malicious schemes that people try and foist on the public. And there are a lot of fairly absurd attempts to solve longitude, which are essentially projects, people trying to get money to create fantastical inventions. So the problem is you have all of these jokes about madness and projecting, and how do you actually, given that longitude, whatever you need to solve longitude has to be a new idea, so it's going to seem outlandish because no one's thought of it before. How do you identify that as not being either mad or a project? And one of Sabel's things is that Harrison isn't taken seriously as a genius. But actually, if you look at the ways in which he interacts with the Board of Longitude, he can't express himself very well. He has this... So it's clear that a lot of what is written for him in the press is actually ghostwritten by other people. Because there's one pamphlet that he produces in 1775, right at the end of my story, which is clearly written by him. And it makes almost no sense at all. He has sentences that last for 3 pages and have... 3 layers of footnotes, so there'll be a footnote and then a footnote to the footnote and then a footnote to that footnote, and yeah, he doesn't make sense. So it's clear that one of the ways in which the board had trouble interacting with him, I think, that they were actually worried that he was going mad and that they weren't going to be able to get this information from him in a way that other people could understand. And as the period goes on, so sort of after the John Harrison story, the Board of Longitude get hundreds of submissions of what are labelled in the archive as crazy or impractical schemes, particularly for things like perpetual motion. So they have this constant relationship with kind of mad schemes. So again, I brought you a little example. And I like this because it's actually from the Board of Longitude archives, because one of the things I should have said is that the interesting thing about the period I'm looking at is that it's actually very little covered in the Board of Longitude archives, because it's when the commissioners don't meet very often, they're not institutionalised, so there are very few minutes or records. So actually we need to look outside in the cultural history to be able to trace this. But I like this one because it's from the Board of Longitude archives. And again, this is actually much later than John Harrison, so it's from the 1820s. But he, this guy called James Stracock wrote a proposal, in fact using a timekeeper, to the board, and then again he ended it with a poem. And this is pretty much, I think this is my favourite thing I found, or one of my 2 favourite things I found. The letter ended with, so says a weather-beaten, worn-out tar, who now unfit for sea lays up in port, and tries with reason's tackle, winch or bar, to draw fair truth from the purveying of thought. So it's the kind of genius madness thing. Then beam a smile benign on the old lad, and when you hear brain sweat runs through his cap, while spreading the earth's surface on a plane, or fathom, of his lines for a true map, so again, mapping, do not cry out such labour is in vain, nor fancy he is foolish, drunk, or mad.
That's fantastic.
So, yeah.
I feel like I might need to close my own PhD with a poem about brain sweat.
Yeah, exactly. I like the idea of brain sweat as well.
Ensuring people that we're not mad as
Yes.
well, although sometimes risking it. That's fascinating. I suppose I was going to ask a little bit more about those jokes and mad schemes. I mean, are there particular other ones that leap out?
So you get there's a character called William Weston, who's quite well known, who is was actually a professor at Cambridge in the 1710s. He took over from Newton as a Lucasian professor at Trinity.
Shoes.
Exactly, and he was one of Newton's kind of disciples. And he actually got kicked out of Cambridge for having too vocal dissenting religious views. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things is that dissenting religion is actually quite bound up in people who are interested in the longitude problem in the 18th century. And Weston moved to London. He becomes an itinerant, a lecturer in coffee houses in London. And he's actually involved in creating a proposal for solving longitude, which is bound up with the passing of the Act in 1714. And his proposal is fairly nonsensical. It involves mooring barges at longitude and latitude points in the sea permanently, which would then send up flares at pre-agreed times, which vessels could then time the difference between when they see the light and when they hear the explosion to work out where they are. Okay. So there's obviously a lot of problems with this. The simplest being, how do you moor a ship in the middle of the sea in a permanent space? But so Weston becomes a running joke. If we go on to the social discussion, which is what you're most interested in, obviously latitude and longitude are boundaries on a map. And the way in which the words are used in the period, they're used as a means of discussing what are socially appropriate behaviours. So the latitude and longitude of someone's behaviour. And you get a lot of really bad, smutty poetry making jokes about male philosophers who can't achieve longitude with their young wives, who therefore take too much latitude and have affairs.
Okay.
So you
not the kind of guys who get about climate change.
No, true. So it's not exactly the same with climate change.
There. No, this is, yeah.
But, and you also get actual jokes. So, again, I brought you an example. Mm-hmm. So this is from the right period. So this is from 1751, from a book called Ben Jonson's Jests, and it's this huge tome about this big of contemporary jokes. And there are 3 jokes about longitude in it, surprisingly, and this is one of them. So it's some pretenders to the mathematics at a tavern near St Paul's were debating the other day about the longitude, while the drawer, as in the pub master, barman, thank you, pub master, while the barman was waiting, and one of these mighty philosophers observed that the longitude might be easily discovered could they but find the perpetual motion. And there's a constant thing about if you have perpetual motion, you can keep time more accurately. Upon this, the barman ran out, and calling his mistress, "Here, gentlemen," says he, "here is the perpetual motion for you, and now I hope you'll find the longitude." So the idea being that women never stop talking, so she is the perpetual motion. Madam was angry, and taking up the bottle, knocked him down. "There, sirrah," says she, "learn to know your own latitude, and for the future don't make so free with your superiors." So you get all these jokes about kind of longitude and latitude and people taking too much latitude.
Yeah, which is, I suppose, something we'd still say as well.
Exactly, yes. And a lot of it is often, there's also a lot about women and women doing science and it being an inappropriate subject for women to be interested in.
Okay. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? Because I think that's really interesting.
So partly, I was talking about the smutty poetry. Mm-hmm. So the thing that interests me about that is that it's always women taking the initiative and doing the science, which is mixed up with them cuckolding their husband. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of power relationship both in terms of sex but also in terms of knowledge that happens in those. And you get a lot of contemporary discussions about how women shouldn't bother their tender heads about understanding navigation because their poor little brains can't cope with the complex ideas. Mm-hmm. But then you get these other satirical discussions using kind of where women are kind of stepping out of a gender role by doing navigational science. So obviously, because they're satirical and they're smutty, there's a level of you can't read them at face value, but the fact that longitude is being used in this critical way, it's all mixed up with kind of what are appropriate actions for women to take in society in terms of what knowledge they have and what they don't have.
It seems that it's also bound up in kind of wider questions. I mean, you mentioned dissenting religion being tied in with longitude research, but also with wider questions of national politics as well. I mean, how does that manifest itself in the cultural materials that you work with?
You would think that something like being able to navigate more easily at sea would be something you'd want to keep as a British solution and not share with other nations, particularly given that Britain is at war with France for most of the 18th century, give or take. But actually, there doesn't seem to be a particular attempt to keep discussions and solutions secret from other countries. And foreign nationals do send in proposals to the Board of Longitude in Britain, so they get them from France and from Italy and from Germany or Prussia. And there are, in the 1760s, when Harrison is in discussions with the board about how he's going to show them how the clock works, you get a delegation that come over from France to be involved in that, in him presenting his ideas. And in the end, they actually aren't, because he is very distrustful of sharing his ideas with anyone, really.
So not just the French.
Not just the French, but he also, there's this brilliant line where when he gets particularly upset with the Board of Longitude in a meeting, he storms out of the meeting saying something like, he will never comply with them so long as he has a drop of English blood left in his body. So he seems to have a bit more of a kind of national concern than people like the commissioners, who are more involved in the kind of Republic of Letters type open sharing of knowledge kind of ethos. But then what you do get outside of that space is, again, you get the ideas of latitude and longitude lines and mapping being used to map contemporary political ideas. So one of my other favourite things I found is this brilliant map, which is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford from the 1720s, and it's called A New and Exact Map of Toryland, and it's anti-Tory, pro-Whig, very clearly, and it's a map of Toryland, which has coastlines to do with things like arbitrary government and popery, and all the points and islands are named things like that, and the Pretender and Jacobite armies and things like that. And then there's Whigland next to it, which has things like religious toleration and constitutional monarchy and things like that. But it's interesting because it's the title locates Toryland as being at the latitude of 1688 and the longitude of 1714. So it uses the date of the Glorious Revolution and the date of the Hanoverian succession to locate where Toryland sits on the map. But of course, the longitude line being 1714 is also the date that the Longitude Act is passed. So there's all this kind of...
So it's all bound up in these... actually, just on that map, I suppose what I wanted to ask is if you could, for people who might not be as familiar with these divisions, give just some idea of who the Whigs are, who the Tories are, and what these divisions mean. Okay, so the Whigs and the Tories are the two main political parties in the 18th century. And in 1714, when the Longitude Act is passed, it's passed just before Queen Anne dies, when the Tories are in power. And Queen Anne dies, the Hanoverians come into power, and the Tories fall from power, and then the Whigs come in. And the Tories would see themselves very simplistically as being supporting of the monarchy, the established church, landed wealth, kind of old-fashioned values, essentially, you might say. The Whigs are the liberals, essentially, if you want to use kind of more modern examples. So they're interested in religious toleration, constitutional monarchy, so a reasonable amount of power for Parliament, the rise of commercial wealth involved in trade and finance. One of the things that's interesting is that both parties are seemingly just as interested in solving something like longitude at sea. So there isn't really a political dimension to the actual parliamentary support for longitude. Also, both can equally kind of access the language of latitude and longitude as in that map and use it to beat the other ones.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, that's fascinating. So this is obviously something that causes feelings to run high throughout the 18th century, and it's a huge, as you say, it's a popular problem. Have you got any interesting stories about times when this spills over in particular?
Well, I've actually got one brilliant story, which I keep saying that something is my favourite thing, but this is my absolute favourite thing that I've found in my research. And this is from the Old Bailey collections online. And this is from 1691. Well, no, the trial is from 1692. So on the 28th of October 1691, two gentlemen friends, John Glendon and Rupert Kempthorne, were in the Ship Tavern in Temple Bar in London. And I'll quote from the record now. Some differences arose between them about latitude and longitude, Mr. Kempthorne alleging that there was no such word as longitude. After that, further angry words arose, and essentially they insult each other. And Rupert Kempthorne kills John Glendon with his sword. It is decided by the court that there was no premeditated malice, so he's found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. But he essentially commits murder over the question of whether the word longitude exists, which is brilliant.
Well, yeah, kind of gives an idea that this is something that's actually, that's causing bar fights.
Yes, exactly. I wish I had more examples of bar fights. Sadly, that's the only one.
That's the only one. Yeah.
I imagine that John Harrison may have got in some bar fights, but
he sounds like the kind of person who would have.
Yeah, exactly.
But presumably that's not the only time that feelings ran high and that people, even if it was the only death by sword,
death by longitude,
to emerge from it.
There's a lot of discussions in newspapers and in various pamphlets where they people who are proposing different methods will quite happily insult all the other methods and say everyone else is an idiot, mine is much more sensible, and they'll pick on other people's proposals and say this one makes no sense because of this. And then people in the newspapers will say, will equally say the Board of Longitude don't know what they're talking about, they don't judge proposals properly, these sort of things. So people get very angry about it.
It's a constant row.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned that one source that you've drawn on already is from the Old Bailey online archives. And I wanted to ask you more broadly about the kinds of sources that you've used and what you found interesting about them, if there have been particular difficulties. Just how you actually go about researching a project like this, particularly when, as you've said, the Board of Longitude minutes are maybe not as complete as you might like them to be.
Yeah, the thing that marks out how the sources that I use from the other people on the project, because most of the rest of the project use very much the Board of Longitude archives, and I use them a little bit, but as I said, there aren't that many for my period. So I essentially couldn't really do this project without online databases, or rather I could, but it would take me more than the 3 years that I am supposed to do it in. So I particularly use something called ECHO, which is 18th Century Collections Online, which is a huge database of scanned pamphlets, novels, publications in general from the 18th century from a whole host of different libraries, like the British Library, libraries in America, it's mainly Europe and America, and it's text searchable. So you can type in the word longitude and a date range and it will come up with, well, if you type in the word longitude and the date range 1680 to 1775, it comes up with something like 14,500 records,
right? Which
I then spend 2.5 years going through.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big sources I've used. Obviously, that comes with certain problems in that if you just use that, you're limiting yourself to what is available online.
Not what's discussed explicitly.
But what that does do is it enables me to find discussions of longitude that I wouldn't have found otherwise, because they're throwaway comments in novels or in plays, or they're jokes, which I wouldn't ever have thought there would be longitude jokes. So that's one of the big sources. Then I also use eBay, which is a similar source for early 18th century books online, and then just crawling through library catalogues, looking for anything that has the word longitude in the title, and then the other main thing I use is, because I use a lot of visual print material like the Hogarth, so something like the British Museum collections online are brilliant. They have high resolution images of almost everything, which you can download for free, as long as you're not going to publish it. And they're very well catalogued as well, so you can word search those, and I've just spent many happy days looking through hundreds of different prints on the British Museum
And we'll be including some interesting links to particular favourites
Yes,
of yours so that
exactly.
people can check them out for themselves, find their own longitude lunatics as well.
Yes.
Next of all, I suppose I wanted to ask, because one of the things that's been waiting since we began this is this £20,000. So there is a reward here, and John Harrison is kind of feverishly working away possibly towards it. Do you want to bring the story on a little bit more and tell us what happens with Harrison and what happens with the reward?
Okay, so no one ever wins the reward, if you want to think of it as winning. What happens eventually? So in the 1760s, Harrison's fourth timekeeper, which is known colloquially as H4, which is a watch about that sort of size, is sent on 2 trials. And essentially, when it goes on the trials, it fulfills the terms set down by the original act. But the Board of Longitude decide that, and I was talking about them needing to understand how the watch works and this sort of thing, so they decide that they will give Harrison half of the money when he shows them how it works, and then they will give him the other half when he makes copies, because at the moment they've got this one glorious watch which has worked on one voyage to and from the West Indies. And this is enshrined in a new act in 1765. They then spend the next 9 years arguing about how Harrison is going to fulfil those terms, and essentially he refuses to do this, to put very simply. So in 1773, by this point, John Harrison, I should say his son William Harrison is also very involved in this story, because by this point Harrison is in his late 70s, early 80s, which in the 18th century is really
Very
old.
old,
And he's increasingly cantankerous and grumpy, and he can't express himself, as I already discussed. So William Harrison, his son, is pretty much his spokesman by this point. And they have managed to attract the attention of George III, the monarch, and they do some tests on Harrison's chronometers in George III's observatory in Richmond. And George III essentially takes on the Harrison's case, and he advises Parliament that they should award a gratuity to Harrison. And so what Parliament do is vote to Harrison a lump sum which is almost the £10,000 that would make up the reward. They actually vote him, I think it's something like 8,250. So he essentially gets almost the £20,000 if you add it all up, but he's never officially awarded the Great Reward. And once that has happened, the Parliament dissolve all the previous longitude legislation and create a new act, putting much clearer criteria on what you can win, and then no one ever wins.
So no one ever manages
No
to
one
get around
ever,
it.
no one ever gets it.
So Harrison's the closest they ever get.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's interesting. And then ultimately the Board of Longitude, you say, kind of stops being focused on.
So this is the interesting thing as well, in that you'd sort of think that at this point they've kind of fulfilled their function, in that someone has found a means of measuring longitude at sea, the equivalent of the reward has been awarded, but there's still all the discussions around how you make the timekeepers, how you make them on a sufficiently big and cheap scale to give them to an entire navy. So they get involved in a lot of processes with particularly two other clockmakers called John Arnold and Thomas Earnshaw, about making these clocks more efficiently and more cost effectively. And then they also get involved in developing the other method, which I briefly mentioned, the lunar distance method. And Neville Maskelyne, who's the kind of evil villain in Darby Savell's story, he is involved in creating something called the Nautical Almanac, which is tables that are published every year by the Board of Longitude to help mariners calculate lunar distance at sea. And then they also become involved in other navigational projects, so things like the search for the Northwest Passage, attempts to reach the North Pole, and the Board of Longitude becomes responsible for administering prize money which is associated with those two projects. And then eventually in 1828, and this is something that one of the other PhD students on the project works on, the board is abolished and essentially becomes an advisory committee to the government. But that's well outside my period, and that's very simplistically put.
And then last of all, the question, I suppose the question is, this is part of a much wider project, as you say, with multiple PhD students and various people stewarding the whole thing. That's, I mean, for a lot of us working in the arts and humanities, that's the exception rather than the norm, and a lot of us have to go and kind of plough these furrows and have no idea if what we're doing makes any sense whatsoever. But I suppose, how does that experience differ for you? I mean, have you found it a valuable way to work? Have you found that it has substantial differences to the more kind of solo PhD work?
I really enjoyed it. I think it's really useful being working with two institutions, so both with Cambridge and with the National Maritime Museum, because you're working with people working in both places, and you get the benefit of different types of views. And I think, especially in terms of thinking about how to what we're doing right now, how to communicate your research to a wider audience, working with a museum is really helpful with that. And then, so there's 3 of us doing PhDs, 2 postdocs, 2 curators, and a principal investigator on the team. And it's most of us are based in Cambridge, apart from the curators who are obviously at the museum. But it's nice having a sort of safety net of people who know what you're talking about at a reasonably minute level to discuss things with. And we have meetings every other month when we sort of get together, and we get people to come and talk to us about relevant materials and relevant research. And having those kind of regular discussions can be really stimulating in terms of thinking about what you're doing.
That kind of, getting a group to help you out when you're particularly stuck or something like that. And the very last question, I know I've promised you a last question before, is what comes next with your own research? What would you like to, I mean, you've got to finish the PhD, and then with regard to, what's left to do in the PhD, what are you hoping to find, and then what comes after that?
Okay, so I'm very lucky to be able to say that I'm actually moving to the Maritime Museum next year. I'm going to be the Caird Senior Research Fellow. Which sounds far too grand, I think.
I think it fits perfectly.
And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to do a number of things, but I'm going to expand to look at another aspect of the way longitude was discussed, which has sort of wasn't as obvious to begin with, but has become more apparent to me as I've done the research, which is looking at the importance of the fact that most of the discussions I'm talking about happened in London. So actually, it's not about being at sea. Or, well, you could say it's about being at sea in a conceptual sense, but not in a physical sense. So thinking about the cultural geography of the metropolis and where people live and where they have to go to interact with each other, how London spaces are used to do things like experiments, how instruments are moved around, where the coffee houses are that people are having discussions, those kind of thinking about what having these discussions in the London space does in terms of how it's solved.
That's absolutely fascinating. Well, thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Cambridge PhDcast, presented by me, John Gallagher, and produced by Richard Blakemore and Ruth Rushworth, and produced in association with CRASSH. If you'd like to hear more from us and for our fantastic collection of PhDcasters, please visit the CRASSH website at crash, that's with 2 S's, .cam.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.